Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
Positronic hypersonic.
I'm Barry P. Cook, and I'm here to give you my recap and review of Spider-Man Brand New Day. So let's get into it. As the film starts, things pick up right where they left off after Doctor Strange's spell made the world forget that Peter Parker exists. Peter's friend Ned and his girlfriend MJ have moved on and have started as new students at MIT, while Peter has been anonymously protecting New York City as its celebrated hero, Spider-Man. While in his personal life, he distances himself from others, and this goes on for 4 years, after which Ned and MJ graduate from MIT. Spider-Man then intervenes when a tank rampages through the city and ends up crashing through an outer wall of the Department of Damage Control. It turns out that the person driving the tank had been telepathically possessed. At that point, the telepath jumps from person to person, evading capture, and orchestrates the escape of the Spider-Man villain, Scorpion. Peter then makes inquiries with Yelena Bulova, aka the new Black Widow, who tells him that someone has been repeatedly attacking the Department of Damage Control, the DODC, in search of something called VMAX. Peter then questions the head of the DODC, who claims ignorance of the telepath. Parker then has a chance encounter with Ned and MJ, who've moved back to New York City after graduating from MIT. Ned and MJ, of course, don't recognize him, and MJ has a new boyfriend. Peter returns home in distress and has some kind of physical bodily attack, waking up the next morning, cocooned to the outside of the building, and finding that he has enhanced senses as well as organic webbing coming out of his wrists. Despite struggling with these new mutations, Peter intervenes when the Scorpion is spotted in the city. It turns out that the Scorpion was possessed by the telepath, and he taunts Peter, which causes Peter to react with uncharacteristic super violence when his arachnid DNA kicks in an amped up fashion. Hoping to control his new mutations, Peter finds Dr. Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk, to ask him about the inhibitor that he uses to keep the Hulk from coming out. After the discussion, Peter builds an inhibitor of his own to suppress his new mutations, as well as a universal inhibitor with which he wants to depower the telepath. He then encounters the telepath on the street, who lets him know that he's been in Peter's house and that he knows about MJ, and they threaten to hurt her if Peter gets in their way. Peter, of course, races to MJ, whom the telepath then possesses, unbeknownst to Peter, and attempts to kill her, but not before pretending to make Peter think that MJ had spontaneously remembered who he was and kissing Peter. Peter then concedes defeat after narrowly saving MJ from a fall off the building, though he then does end up seeing the telepath and takes a picture of her with his heads-up display. He then takes MJ to the home of Frank Castle, aka the Punisher, whom he had encountered earlier during the pursuit of the tank. The idea being that Frank would keep her safe. With Castle's equipment and MJ's insight, Peter completes both inhibitors that he was making. When the telepath again attacks the DODC, she does it in person, using a possessed Hulk that Peter has to fight. Banner eventually comes back to himself, and Peter subdues the telepath, who's taken into the care of the director of the DODC. When Peter returns to Castle's home, MJ confronts him with the letter that he wrote for her and Ned, explaining the spell that erased their memories. He explains himself, but MJ apologizes because she doesn't know him, and she doesn't reciprocate his feelings. He then takes her home, and she invites him into the apartment she shares with Ned so that he can see Ned, and the three spend time together. After hearing MJ describe what it was like being possessed, Peter realizes that the DODC director lied to him. He contacts Yelena, who finds redacted DODC records revealing the telepath's identity to be Jean Grey, who of course is a powerful telepath who has been in the X-Men. It turns out that Jean is searching for her sister Sarah Grey, who was kidnapped by the DODC. The only clue she has is VMAX, a message she heard telepathically from Sarah, but the DODC director says he doesn't know what it means and continues experimenting on Jean's brain. Jean then realizes that VMAX is the text on the air vent above the holding cell that her sister was kept in, the last thing that she saw before she died. Enraged, Jean's abilities grow more powerful, and she psionically locks the city around her, or half of it anyway. Peter is partially immune to Jean's abilities, and enters the DODC to rescue her. Jean rebuffs his attempts and forces him to fight members of the Hand who had previously been recruited to the DODC. Peter then removes his inhibitor and embraces his new mutations gaining enhanced strength, speed, and organic webs to defeat the Hand. When he reaches Jean, she enters his mind and experiences a loving memory with Peter's Aunt May, who accepted his abilities but loved him for himself. Peter offers Jean understanding over her loss. Castle, outside the building, attempts a sniper shot at Jean, but Peter intercepts it. Peter wakes in the hospital with Castle, who explains that Jean kept him alive until medical help arrived. In the aftermath of everything, Jean quietly leaves the city, the DODC comes under investigation, and Peter vows that he won't continue to distance himself from the entire world in order to continue to be Spider-Man. In fact, when he sees Ned again, at random, he introduces himself. In a post-credits scene, Ned's Spidey tracker appears to show Spider-Man, a Spider-Man anyway, located on another world that isn't Earth. So I actually think this is the best Spider-Man movie we've had in a long time. I like the more mature Peter and the more mature Ned and MJ. I think it's great that they're showing the characters age and grow and change as people do. I thought that was really cool. I'm glad that the whole movie wasn't spent on Peter trying to get MJ and Ned to remember him. There was a real chance that they could have made the whole movie about that, and I think it would have been awful, so I'm glad that they didn't. I think the story overall was a much more mature superhero story than what we got in the last couple of movies. And I think it was much better executed than the stories that we got in the last couple of movies. I really felt the stakes. I found Jean to be menacing as a villain. So I really liked that. To a certain extent, both the Hulk and the Punisher kind of felt wedged in, not that they didn't use them well. I think they used them well, but I think if you take them out of it, the story's exactly the same. It was great having that Spider-Man Hulk fight, but really you could have lost that and the movie would have been just as good. It doesn't take away from the movie though, so it's fine. But, if you're analyzing it after the fact, it kind of feels like, they did it to do it and didn't really need to do it. But because it didn't ruin the movie or anything, and it didn't seem to not have any actual point, it's fine, because I think it did have a point, especially some of the character development that goes on between Peter and Frank. But again, without it, the movie's still good, so it is kind of just filler, but it's filler that I think was enjoyable, so it's fine. Same for the Hulk. The one thing about Frank, though, is I'd like to know where this movie sits in the timeline, because the last time we saw Frank in the one-off Punisher special, he's very messed up, and in this, he seems less messed up. And so is this afterwards and he's had time to sort of heal, or is it before he kind of breaks down? I don't know. It would be interesting to know where it is in the timeline. But ultimately, in this film, the Punisher comes off really well. I really enjoyed him being in it. And, it was great to see Jean Grey. This is the first incursion of Jean Grey in the MCU, if I'm not mistaken. So I thought that was really cool. And, in the end, they did leave it hopeful that maybe Ned will remember Peter at least, which could mean that MJ will remember. And they did that by showing that Ned remembers the special handshake they did for some reason. So I think that's cool. And it does say at the end that Spider-Man will return. So, I think there's time for that story to evolve. And I think it would have been cheap if they resolved it all, within this movie. So I think it's fine that they didn't. I think it's better that they didn't. I loved seeing Yolana. She's one of my favorite MCU characters. I thought it was great that she was in it in 2 scenes, so it was really cool. We had a cameo from Aunt May, which is also great. It's always good to see Marissa Tomei. I was a little confused as to how MJ found the letter because Peter had been keeping it in a cup in his room. But then all of a sudden it was on his person when he was at Frank's and he left it behind somehow when he left her there. I thought that was a little wonky and a plot device, but it's a really, really minor thing. I read somewhere online that someone had critiqued the movie saying that it's 2 movies meshed together as if that's a bad thing. I think they're right. I think it is 2 movies meshed together to an extent, but they managed to weave it in there, or weave it together, I should say, really well. I think the main plot, of course, is the Jean Grey plot, and then the subplot was kind of Peter's life and, how he was going to reconnect with Ned and MJ. And I think they gave that plot just enough time. It wasn't too much, it wasn't too little, and they didn't wrap it all up in a nice bow at the end, and I think that that's great. I think it would have been cheesy had they done that, as I said. So, yeah, it's kind of 2 movies in one, but I think it really worked, and I really enjoyed it. The only critique I really have about this movie is that they didn't explain at all what's going on with Peter's biology. I mean, there's a moment where he's watching a video about spiders, and it kind of says, stuff about how spiders change and whatnot, but I didn't think that was enough. And what's weird about that is in the trailer, if I'm not mistaken, there are lines of dialogue where someone is explaining to him a little bit about what's happening to him. And that's not in the movie, which I think is unfortunate. I think that should have been in the movie. It would have been nice to have an actual explanation of what's happening to him, but they left it out. They didn't put it in. So that's really the only critique I have. I think, the movie looked great. The action sequences were crazy. I really liked the quote unquote villain. I thought that they did a good job making you feel the stakes. And, it's just a really well paced, well written, well acted, good looking movie. And that's really all there is to it. And like I said, it's much better than the last few Spider-Man movies, I think. I didn't really care for the last one, even though everybody thought it was great. I didn't really care for it that much, but this one I really liked. I really think they did a good job. So I'd have to give it at least 4 out of 5 stars, if not 4.5. And that's really all I have to say. So I'm going to get out of here. I'll be back with another video soon. Until I return, I wish you peace and long life.